to Ms. Pramila Patten.
Mr. President, distinguished, can you hear me?
Go ahead, please.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I wish to thank the Albanian presidency for organizing this meeting and for inviting me to brief. In April, on the occasion of the annual open debate of the Security Council on sexual violence in conflict, I posed the question, what do the 10 resolutions on women, peace and security, 5 of which focus squarely on preventing and addressing conflict-related sexual violence, mean right now for a woman in Ukraine? This was the question which compelled me to visit Ukraine in early May. Painfully, my visit cast into stark relief the gap that still exists between the aspiration of prevention expressed by this Council through the robust normative framework that has been established over the past decade and the reality on the ground for the most vulnerable. The commitment of the Security Council is unequivocal to bring all tools to bear to break the seemingly sexual violence and impunity. The resolutions on sexual violence articulate the elements of a compliance regime to influence the conduct of perpetrators and potential perpetrators. The resolutions reinforce international humanitarian law, which makes it clear that even wars have limits and sexual violence is beyond the scope of acceptable conduct, even in the midst of battle. These limits have been universally agreed upon and must be universally respected. They include a categorical prohibition on all forms of sexual violence, which can never be excused, justified, or amnestied. Yet, as the conflict in Ukraine passes the 100-day mark, we are faced with mounting allegations of sexual violence. Due to active hostilities, mass internal displacement, the breakdown of referral pathways for services, and stigma associated with sexual violence, victims have often been unable or unwilling to report to law enforcement authorities or service providers. Referral pathways for relevant services are not, especially in eastern Ukraine. For example, prior to 24th of February, 20 medical service delivery points and maternity hospitals were providing assistance to survivors of gender-based violence with the support of UNFPA. As of 18th of April, only 9 such facilities were operational due to damage from hostilities and staffing shortages. In the current context, many allegations of conflict-related sexual violence are difficult, if not impossible, to verify, making it challenging to assess prevalence. As of 3rd of June, the Human Rights Monitoring Team of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has received reports of 124 alleged acts of conflict-related sexual violence occurring against women, girls, men, and boys in Chernihiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, Kharkiv, Kherson, Kyiv, Luhansk, Mykolaiv, Vinnytsia, Zaporizhia, Zakarpattia, and Zhytomyr regions. Women constitute most of the alleged victims. 56 of 124 allegations concern women. 49 of the allegations are against children, 41 against girls, 7 against boys, and in one case, the gender was unknown. 19 of the allegations are against men, including rape, attempted rape, forced public stripping, and threat of sexual violence. Verification of cases is still ongoing. From our experience of conflict the world over, we know that sexual violence is the most consistently and massively underreported violation, and that available data only represents the tip of the iceberg. An active battlefield is never conducive to accurate bookkeeping. But if we wait for hard data and statistics, it will always be too late. This is why we must realize immediately on the basis of our common conviction that even one case of sexual violence is unacceptable. We do not need hard data for a scaled up humanitarian response, nor for all parties to put in place preventive measures. In this regard, I wish to acknowledge and commend the leadership by example of the Ukrainian authorities in their agreement of a framework of cooperation with the United Nations on the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence that was signed by the Deputy Prime Minister Olha Stefanishyna on 3rd of May in Kyiv as an outcome of my visit. This framework will serve as the basis for a comprehensive and multifaceted preventive and service response and more effective coordination of all stakeholders, including the United Nations agencies in Ukraine and neighboring countries. Allow me, Mr. President, to emphasize 5 critical areas of the framework. First, strengthening rule of law and accountability as a central aspect of deterrence and prevention of crimes of sexual violence. Second, strengthening the capacity of the security and defense sector to prevent sexual violence. This will require specific action plans by the military, police, border guards, and other government security and defense forces, encompassing also over 100,000 volunteer forces. Third, ensuring that survivors of sexual violence, as well as their children, have access to comprehensive services, including sexual and reproductive health, psychological, legal, socioeconomic services, and reintegration support. This will entail support to Ukraine's national health and social services systems. Fourth, even as we deal with the immediate challenge of conflict unabated, we must cast ahead to ongoing and future negotiations for cessation of hostilities and ensure that sexual violence is addressed in the framework of a ceasefire agreement and that such crimes are ultimately reflected in specific provisions of any peace agreement, including those related to security arrangements and transitional justice mechanisms. These include ensuring that amnesties for sexual violence crimes are explicitly prohibited. Furthermore, it is essential that we ensure the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in all political processes, including negotiations for peace. Ukrainian women-led organizations are active on the front lines of the sexual and gender-based violence response, yet women have been conspicuously absent from the negotiating table thus far. Fifth, addressing conflict-related trafficking in persons for the purpose of sexual exploitation and prostitution. This will entail awareness raising and training of military personnel, border guards, police and immigration officials, and will require action of neighboring and receiving countries and the institutions of the European Union. Too often, the needs of women and girls in conflict settings have been sidelined and treated as an afterthought. This framework of cooperation makes them an explicit priority, and I call on the solidarity of this Council and the international donor community to support the Ukrainian authorities and relevant UN entities to implement the framework. Fundamentally, this is as important for Ukraine's future as the defense and security sector expenditures, for which billions of dollars have already been mobilized. I also wish to note that last week I had the opportunity to debrief the mission of the Russian Federation to the UN on my visit to Ukraine. I emphasized that my office is at the disposal of all parties to the conflict to support the implementation of preventive measures that mitigate the acute risk of conflict-related sexual violence. Resolutions 1820, 1888, 1960, 2106, and 2467 provide a clear and unanimously agreed preventive framework, which includes issuance of clear orders through military chains of command that reinforce zero tolerance for sexual violence, and the designation of high-level civilian and military focal points to engage with my office and other relevant UN actors, among other measures. I look forward to further consultation with the mission of the Russian Federation to the UN on possible modalities for cooperation in this sphere, including the facilitation of access to areas not under Ukrainian government control. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I wish to bring particular attention to the trafficking dimension. As the Secretary General stated in March, for predators and human traffickers, war is not a tragedy. It is an opportunity. Women and children fleeing the conflict are being targeted for trafficking and exploitation, in some cases facing further exposure to rape and other risks while seeking refuge. In addition to my engagement with the Polish and Moldovan local and state authorities, I visited reception centers and border crossing points in both countries. We must acknowledge and commend the outpouring of financial and moral support for the Ukrainian people by national and local authorities, as well as private citizens, which is perhaps unprecedented in modern times. Yet the protection challenges related to the displacement in the past 100 days of close to 14 million people, mostly women and children, 6.8 million of whom have fled across borders, is also unprecedented. From the outset of this conflict, heightened risk of trafficking in persons, including for the purpose of sexual exploitation and prostitution, have been alarmingly evident. The lack of consistent vetting of accommodation offers and transportation arrangements is a serious concern, as well as the limited capacity of protection services to address the velocity and volume of displacement. There are also concerns regarding the multiplicity of volunteers with limited vetting and little or no training or experience. In Chemicho, Poland, my team and I visited the site of the Tesco supermarket that has been converted into a receiving center for Ukrainian refugees. While the range of services being provided is exemplary, there are grave security and protection concerns in a facility run by volunteers and with only a bare-bone presence of UN agencies. For example, we heard a number of credible anecdotal accounts from humanitarian staff. With minimal security screening, a man registers as a volunteer at the Tesco Center in the afternoon and enters the French room where refugees are waiting for transport to France. At that time, he makes contact with a 19-year-old woman whom he later wakes up at 2 a.m. offering a ride to France. Another volunteer becomes suspicious of this individual roaming the sleeping quarters in the early morning hours and intervenes. Another man wearing a yellow volunteer's vest and standing with a sign at the Chemichov train station hall is offering free transport from Poland to Germany. Other volunteers became suspicious and informed local law enforcement when they noticed that the man was selecting only young women for transportation in his minivan. In Warsaw, during a meeting with officials from the Ministry of Justice, a judge of a criminal court shared with me how while she was in the Chechov reception center, she was personally approached by a man who sought her help to have access to 8 young women and adolescent girls whom he had identified and wanted to offer transportation to Germany. She told me that even as a judge, she was not initially suspicious until a volunteer intervened and informed her that the same men had been coming every 2 days to handpick young women and girls. The judge made an urgent appeal for awareness raising and training of law enforcement officials and other relevant actors. Within the humanitarian response architecture in Ukraine, a temporary task force on human trafficking has been established to strengthen coordination and foster cross-border cooperation, including among criminal justice actors. However, it is critical to ensure that effective protection systems are in place in all transit and destination countries and at all border crossings. Strengthening the overall response to trafficking is a critical aspect of the framework of cooperation, which will also require a coherent and coordinated response at the level of the European institutions. This is of utmost urgency, as I believe that this humanitarian crisis is turning into a human trafficking crisis. This requires a concerted, integrated, and holistic cross-border response by humanitarian partners, law enforcement agencies, forces, immigration officials, and political leaders. A regional compact is urgently required. And in this regard, I'm encouraged that His Excellency Mr. Charles Michel, President of the European Council, is in the Security Council chamber today, as I believe that this issue will require European leadership at the highest levels to address this problem. It will also require the continued focus and leadership of the UN Security Council in line with Resolution 23 related human trafficking and conflict-related sexual violence. I consider this dimension as a core aspect of the CRSV mandate and the Ukraine crisis as a critical litmus test for the implementation of Resolution 2331. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, during my mission, I witnessed with awe the resilience and fortitude shown by the communities affected by this conflict, including the women forced to flee their homes with their children, with nothing but the clothes on their back and the bag of belongings they were able to carry by hand. Many survivors have braved the risk of reprisals and backlash to tell their stories. We owe them more than solidarity. We owe them a swift and serious response. The prevalence of sexual violence in conflict throughout history teaches us that reinforcing prevention, protection, and service delivery is critical from the onset of any armed conflict. The framework, of course, which I have referred, paves the way politically for tangible support and technical advice and assistance from my office and the wider UN system, and will also serve as a platform for the mobilization of resources. To address this challenge, it is crucial to ensure that the level of political focus, as well as the allocation of resources for a comprehensive response, is commensurate with the scale and complexity of the problem. Finally, I wish to acknowledge that even as we focus on Ukraine, the ripple effects of this conflict are also being felt by women and girls in other war zones around the world who risk becoming forgotten victims of forgotten conflict. From Yemen to the Central African Republic, Afghanistan to Myanmar or Tigray in northern Ethiopia, resources are being drained and attention diverted. As other crises escalate behind the scenes, we must reassure all populations at risk that they are not forgotten and that international law is not an empty promise. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Patten for her briefing and for her availability while traveling, and I hope that the little technical glitches did not affect the entirety of the message. I now give the floor to Ms. Natalia Karbowska.